Good afternoon and welcome from Invest Africa to all our valued members and guests. I'm Chantal Carrington, CEO of Invest Africa. It is my pleasure to present to you today's Invest Africa 2024 Outlook for North Africa, the fourth webinar in our series of 6, including West, South, East, Francophone and Lusophone Africa. I am keen to hear, for example, what the experts think about the influence of the global economic factors, such as changes in energy prices and growth rates in major trading partners like the EU, whether regional geopolitics in North Africa and Middle East present a risk to trade and investment, and also which sectors hold the investment opportunities for the largest Africa country by GDP, Egypt. So, without any further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our wonderful moderator for today, Benoit de Monval, partner at DLA Piper, who is joined by Naaku from SMBC and Mikhail from Moody's. Also, just a quick reminder that we will have an opportunity for Q&A towards the end of the webinar, so please do submit what is on your mind. Over to you, Benoit.
Thank you, Chantal. Hello and welcome everyone. I am delighted to have the opportunity to moderate this session, and I am sure that we will have very insightful discussion with our panelists. Joining me today, Naaku Yatma, who is a senior economist for Africa at SMBC Bank International. Based in London, Naaku assesses country risk for North and Sub-Saharan African jurisdiction to support the bank's lending decision. She is a frequent visitor to the region, engaging with policymakers, local financial institutions, and corporates to assess countries' conditions more deeply. She holds an MBA from University of Oxford Said Business School. Welcome, Naaku. Michael Gontran, who is an Assistant Vice President, Analyst in the Sovereign Risk Group for Moody's Investor Service, with responsibilities for a number of credits in Africa and in the Middle East. Michael holds a Master's in International Political Economy from Sciences Po Paris and a Master of Science in Management and Strategy from the London School of Economics. Welcome, Michael. Today's session, we will focus on the economic dynamics and political landscape within the framework of Africa's North Market for 2024. The growth dynamics in North Africa are diverse, influenced by various factors ranging from economic diversification efforts to geopolitical development. While North Africa has many strengths, such as a strategic location, it is located at the crossroads of 3 continents. There's a lot of natural resources, of course, oil and gas in Algeria and Libya, but also a huge potential for renewable energy. Certain concerns persist regarding the quality of growth and its sustainability in the future. During this session, we will try to identify the main factors affecting growth of the region, either positively or negatively. Let's start our discussion by an overview of the region's current dynamics and prospects. Michael, what are your views on it? Especially, could you tell us more about the bright spot and which countries are facing challenges?
Well, thank you very much, Benoit. It's a great pleasure to be here today. As you said, I'm an assistant vice president in the sovereign team at Moody's Investor Service. As a rating agency, I think we focus on sovereign creditworthiness and credit risk. Credit risk essentially addresses the risk that a sovereign may not meet its financial obligations as they come due. In other words, may default. So I think that's the perspective I'll try to bring into the discussion today. I maybe want to begin my answer with some brief thoughts on the way that we at Moody's see the outlook this year at the global level, before zooming in North Africa in more detail. At the global level, we expect conditions will remain difficult for governments, but will not deviate significantly from 2023. Central banks in major economies will keep interest rates high to stave off the risk of sticky inflation. And while this will dampen investment and consumption dynamics, the active use of government policy will also provide economic support. And as we move throughout the year, we expect monetary policy should also loosen somewhat. helping growth to recover closer to pre-pandemic levels. I think it's fair to say that governments globally face a balancing act as they try to bring down debt and achieve fiscal consolidation at a time when social risks are heightened. Higher debt burdens, higher interest bills limit the fiscal capacity of governments to improve living conditions and to address any future external shocks. And I think frontier markets are particularly vulnerable in this environment, with funding staying extremely tight for many. And this means an economic or financial or climate shock could push more of these sovereigns into default in 2024. Geopolitical risks are another key source of risk, and one that I'm sure will feature heavily in this discussion. I think turning now more specifically to North Africa. This slide that you hopefully can see on the screen now shows you our ratings distribution across the MENA region as a whole. MENA being North Africa, but also the Levant, Iraq, and the GCC. And it goes from the highest rated sovereigns in the region, which are the UAE and Abu Dhabi at AA2, just 2 notches below AAA, to the lowest rated, Lebanon at C, which remains in default. Now in North Africa, we rate 3 sovereigns. We have Morocco at the BA1 level, just 1 notch below investment grade, with a stable outlook. And we have Egypt at CAA1 with a negative outlook, and Tunisia at CAA2, also with a negative outlook. Ratings in the CAA category are typically indicative of very high credit risk. So let me maybe briefly discuss Egypt and Tunisia first. We see Egypt as challenged by significant strains on debt affordability and liquidity, as external imbalances drive persistent foreign currency shortages and high interest rates. And we actually changed our outlook on Egypt's rating from stable to negative just last week, reflecting that we now see the balance of risks to the downside. This reflects increasing risks in our view that Egypt's credit profile will continue to weaken amongst the difficult macroeconomic and exchange rate rebalancing. And that's despite continued fiscal consolidation efforts, but also support from the official sector. Egypt has seen a weakening in debt affordability reflected in a jump in the interest bill paid by the government, particularly when you set it against government revenue. Close to 2/3 of government revenue is expected to be spent on interest payments. These are levels that have proven to be unsustainable for many sovereigns in the past. In parallel, persistent foreign exchange shortages are reflected in a widening gap between the official and the parallel market exchange rates. And this is exacerbated by geopolitical disruptions that run the risk of impacting the economy's key foreign currency generating sectors, including tourism and revenues coming from the Suez Canal. Egypt does have a track record of reform implementation that underpins our expectation for an enhanced financial support package from the International Monetary Fund and other official lenders that would backstop the implementation of the $3 billion program that was approved in December 2022, but that has since stalled. Turning now to Tunisia. Tunisia entered the global shock coming from the war in Ukraine nearly 2 years ago, with, I think, a range of pre-existing vulnerabilities. There was a backdrop of large fiscal and external imbalances, persistent twin deficits that have led to a sustained rise in public and external debt ratios. It is a net energy and food importer, combined as well with a system of untargeted energy and food subsidies that has a high fiscal burden. And there has been a lost decade of growth. Growth has been muted since the 2011 Jasmine Revolution, just about 1% on average, one of the lowest rates across developing economies. And that has resulted in insufficient job creation as well as the erosion of living standards. Now, the key challenge from a credit perspective is really the absence of comprehensive financing to date in order to meet the large funding needs of the government. Tunisia has sizable debt payments coming due and must also continue to finance a budget deficit. At the same time, financing remains constrained in the absence of progress on securing a new IMF program, which would be key to catalyzing external funding from a broader base of multilateral but also bilateral partners And so with financing remaining impaired, Tunisia faces a very challenging funding position, as well as pressures on its foreign exchange reserves. Let me maybe finish my remarks with a few words on Morocco, which remains one of the bright spots of the region. The rating that we have on Morocco, BA1, places it at the same rating level as Oman in the MENA region, or indeed, if we look further afield, the same rating as Greece. Fiscal, debt, and liquidity risks are largely contained. The authorities have for some time now spearheaded a strategic shift of the economy towards higher value-added export industries, specifically into the global value chains of the automotive, but also aeronautical sectors. And they are positioning Morocco as a trade hub between Europe and Africa. And we've seen that fiscal, social, economic policies have proven effective at supporting social cohesion and economic activity in the face of several shocks at the cost of a higher but still affordable debt burden. There was of course the sad event of last year's earthquake, but we expect the adverse growth impact to be temporary in light of the substantial reconstruction efforts that are now ongoing. So perhaps on this brighter note, let me turn it back to you, Benoit.
Thank you, Michael. It was very interesting. Naku, do you want to add some spotlight from your perspective as a banker specialist in North Africa, including maybe for Egypt and Morocco, which are big countries in North Africa?
Thank you, Benoit, and good afternoon to the participants. It's a pleasure to be here. And as you rightly said in your introduction, I cover country risk for SMBC, and we're a lender. So we are not only interested in the risk aspects, but we are also interested in the opportunities. And Michael's great and comprehensive introduction highlighted that at the current juncture in both the regional and global economy, there are quite a number of risk factors that we are looking at. But at the same time, thinking of opportunities, we do see the region as underpinned by potentially three factors. One is the demographic base, if we're thinking of opportunities related to domestic markets. So for that reason, Egypt will always remain a hugely important market given its demographics size, its large population, youthful and growing. But this leads to the second issue, which is job creation, and Benoit mentioned that as well. Job creation, broader growth, and the capacity of governments within the region to implement policy to achieve their aspirations around economic transformation. And Morocco is a bright spot because historically it's been able to deliver that. So we've seen Morocco, substantially increases automotive exports, substantially increase renewable power generation to reduce its reliance on imported oil. And the question now for other governments in the region and even Morocco is how much further this transformation can go. If we look at Algeria, for example, it's still very much a mono commodity economy focused on hydrocarbons, oil and gas. And in the current moment, that is important because that will lead to growth driven around exports to Europe. But Algeria, even as a successful commodity exporter, faces challenges around youth and unemployment and broadening its economy. And then let's turn into Egypt, where, and I'm sure we'll get more into the detail as we go along with the session, it's facing a macroeconomic crisis right now. And one of the key determinants of how it emerges out of this is the credibility of government policy around things like reducing the footprint of the state within the economy and actually encouraging FDI and new investors into the country. Egypt has tried to position itself as a regional gas hub. It's also trying to attract investment in this Suez Canal zone around transportation and also manufacturing. But all of this will be dependent on how it emerges from its current crisis. So I started with opportunities, but maybe I'll end more on a crisis risk note there and hand back to you, Benoit.
Thank you, Nako. Regarding you mentioned some concerns about the quality and sustainability of growth in North African market. One can think about the political instability, but also water scarcity and environmental issues. For instance, in Morocco, there's a lot of drought since many years. Nako, in your opinion, what are the critical factors contributing to, and how might they impact the long-term development of this market in Africa?
Thanks, Benoit. That's a really good question because it takes into account both cyclical, structural, and policy factors. So if you take Morocco as an example, growth there has been heavily influenced by climatic effects, by weather, mainly because around 35% or even more of the population is still involved in agriculture. So the government has achieved success in creating a high value-added export sector, but still, a huge share of the population is not involved in that. And the next chapter has to be about broadening higher value-added activities to engage more of the population. And right now, not just in Morocco or in North Africa, but across the continent and in most emerging and frontier markets, governments are dealing with the successive shocks from the pandemic to last year. 4 major global shocks have occurred, and that has impacted their fiscal position. So right now, it might seem very premature to be talking about long-term growth when governments are still focusing on just, responding to the near-term shocks and strengthening their positions. But it's also, the crisis creates the opportunity to actually push through these structural reforms. So, for Morocco, even for Egypt, the crisis is about effecting that structural transformation in the economy to encourage greater investment beyond traditional sectors, to attract foreign investment capital. So I think, back to my initial comment, the focus on government policy at the moment is probably the most important thing that we are looking at, and how credible these government plans are going to be, both in addressing the near-term shocks, but also taking into account longer-term structural transformation.
Thank you, Nako. Michael, do you want to share your views on these concerns?
I think if I agree with everything that's been said. I think environmental risks really present a difficult set of challenges, as you said. But North Africa is a water-stressed and arid region. It's heavily dependent on food imports. It's exposed to climate-related events. And this is at the same time as water-intensive agriculture is an important source of employment and income, whether that's in Egypt, in Tunisia, or in Morocco. I think we're already seeing more frequent and intense episodes of drought in Morocco. In Tunisia, we've seen as well enduring water stress across the agricultural sector. So we've seen quite persistent low rainfall, low dam levels. And that's really weighing on economic growth, I think, particularly over 2023. In Egypt, we've seen the flow of the Nile affected by the decreasing rate of annual rainwater. And at the same time, Egypt is also one of the countries most exposed to rising sea levels in the future. So I think the challenges are clear. The cost of climate mitigation measures will be quite significant. And they'll present a challenge to government finances and push up funding needs throughout the long term. At the same time, I think another challenge, and that's also quite a difficult one that the region faces, and has faced for some time really, is the insufficient pace of job creation. Unemployment in the region is still high, and there continues to be large gender gaps. And I think particularly difficulties for young people, for new entrants to the labor market, for educated graduates. If I take Tunisia, for example, the persistent weakness of the economic outlook has not allowed new entrants to be effectively absorbed into the labor market. So that has implications for migration trends. It has implications for brain drain. It limits the potential for future growth. Or if you look at Egypt, where the median age of the population is around 24, Demographics are still pointing to more population growth, so the need to generate economic opportunities for what is going to remain a rapidly expanding working age population is significant. And then finally, the challenge of informality, which is still substantial across the region. So that means that many are working without social insurance or any formal arrangements. And informality also reduces the tax base. So ultimately the resources that governments have access to.
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to shed some light on Egypt because obviously it is a very important country, as you said, Naku. It is the most populous country in North Africa, and of course, Egypt's economic and social development have significant implications for all the region. Naku, what factors contribute to Egypt's current economic outlook in 2024? And in particular, from your experience, from your perspective, what specific investment opportunities, you said you are looking for opportunities, are those opportunities in Egypt? I imagine which key sectors, and what would be your advice regarding, the key sectors to consider exploring for investors in Egypt?
Thanks, Benoit. So there are two questions. So what are the factors influencing the outlook right now? And what are the key sectors? And factors influencing the outlook, as Michael mentioned in his introduction, right now, Egypt is confronting a crisis that is marked by very elevated levels of inflation, around 35%, also by imbalances in its foreign exchange market. So, and especially over the past few weeks, we've seen a rapid widening in the parallel market exchange rate from, 40 before to now 60 Egyptian pounds to the dollar, where previously it was compared to the official rate of around 40. And at the same time, there's uncertainty. Well, there's increase in likelihood of a return to the IMF program, where not much progress was made in 2023 because of the policymakers' non-delivery of certain actions, particularly around greater flexibility on the exchange rate. So there are all these obvious signs of stresses. Oh, and not to mention as well the impact of the Israel-Hamas war on its major foreign exchange earners, as covered by Michael as well. So there are many stresses happening. There are positives on the outlook in terms of seeing a re-engagement with the IMF and an expanded program, and estimates range from an expanded program going to 6 to 10 billion. And not only IMF returning, but also catalyzing other multilateral and bilateral donor flows to support the government, which clearly Egypt needs right now. But even with this new support, the outlook is going to still remain in sort of crisis mode. It's still going to be challenging because there's a significant need for FX in the economy, and it's not clear that simply IMF or multilateral bilateral funds will be enough to address this gap. So we're still going to see some dislocation, drivers of inflation, and Egypt also remains vulnerable to the global environment in terms of volatility in commodity prices, oil, food especially. And if any global events lead to another resurgence in food prices, Egypt's vulnerabilities will be hit hard. So the near-term outlook is still very much one of navigating a very choppy environment. But longer term, and more thinking about the country, where the government and policymakers are aspiring to take the country, relations with EU are very important, and especially supplying gas, stepping into the Russia void and becoming a hub of gas exports to Europe in the Eastern Mediterranean. There have been a number of MOUs between Egypt, Israel, EU around this topic. And the natural gas sector has received a fair amount of government focus to make it more investment friendly. So that remains one key area of foreign interest into Egypt. Then you have the other branch that is driven by the desire to diversify the economy and to make local corporations more competitive. And this is around also reducing the footprint of government-linked and military-linked companies in the economy by selling off major stakes, by attracting investment, initially from Gulf investors. But now, Egyptian authorities speaking very openly about attracting a broad range of investors. And we do see we do see some potential there because now the IFC is involved as an advisor, and that gives foreign investors a bit more confidence that it will be a transparent process. And also there have been steps taken to reduce, to improve the business environments by removing various legislations that make it difficult, such as licensing, taxation, etc., that give unfair advantages to state-linked companies. So there's clearly conscious efforts there to just broaden the ownership structure of the Egyptian economy. And probably that the final leg in authorities' efforts to attract investment lies around the Suez Canal, and not only increasing investment into the transportation sector, but attracting manufacturers for things like production into the European markets. So this idea of nearshoring and Egypt being a beneficiary because of its proximity to Europe again. So moving production from places like China to Egypt. But all of these investment aspirations still really depend on how persuaded investors will be about the next steps and what will happen, whether there'll be a credible currency devaluation, whether there'll be substantial enough support from international partners to create an attractive environment for investors to step in.
Thank you, Naku. Regarding the economic factors, Naku, you mentioned that inflation has been rising significantly for some time, and that affects, of course, energy prices and growth rates in major, trading partners like the European Union. How do you anticipate the impact of these changes on the economic outlook for North African market for the coming months?
The impact of rising oil prices specifically, or the global environment?
No, I think specifically.
Okay. The region is interesting because the markets are quite different, and as Mikhail's initial slide showed, you have such different credit ratings. So you have hydrocarbon producers who are going to benefit from higher energy prices, and then you have net energy importers like Morocco, who will remain vulnerable, or whose growth path will remain vulnerable to higher energy prices. For the moment, energy prices still remain calm, but I think the concern in the market is that these can easily spike depending on geopolitical events. But for the moment, net energy importers are enjoying some relief from the current environment. But that being said, oil prices are still not that very low, so it's also beneficial for the energy exporters. So at the moment, and provided that this balance can continue for the rest of the year, energy costs are, I would say, supportive in general for the region.
You were talking on the geopolitical side. We know that the Abraham Accords signed in 2020 represent a huge shift in the political dynamic of Middle East, but also in North Africa, because Morocco has agreed to normalize the relationship with Israel. And in Morocco, at least, we see an increase of Israeli investment. Unfortunately, as Naku said, there's the Israel-Hamas war now. Mikhail, how do you regional geopolitics in North Africa and more broadly in the Middle East present a risk to other sectors like tourism, trade, or investment as a whole?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think regional geopolitical strains are a key obstacle for the region. And of course, the military conflict between Israel and Hamas is currently at the center stage of this. At Moody's, our baseline scenario continues to assume that we see the conflict remaining largely concentrated in Gaza, but for a protracted period. At the same time, I think the risk of a miscalculation, which triggers an escalation into a wider, a more multi-front conflict across the broader region, I think that risk increases the longer the conflict goes on. And I think certainly the military conflict could fuel higher oil prices and tighten financial conditions globally if it were to drag into neighboring countries. We've also seen disruption across the Red Sea. So, we expect shipping companies to be deterred from using the Red Sea with more subdued trade passing through the Suez Canal. The number of commercial vessels transiting through the canal has already seen a fairly noticeable decline. So this will increase transport and logistics costs, and rerouting through Africa, through the Cape of Good Horn, that adds about 10 days to European routes. So ultimately that hurts businesses. It also hurts consumers if the higher costs are passed through, and particularly in Europe, which is quite dependent on the trade through the canal. I think for Egypt itself, the Red Sea developments, the intensification of regional hostilities, that will impact the key foreign exchange generating sectors of the economy. So tourism, travel, the Suez Canal revenue. Those have been, I think it's fair to say, very solid FX generating sectors in the past. But the fact that they are being impacted adds the strain on the balance of payments at what is already a difficult time. So it partly depends on the length of the disruptions. I think a few months would be absorbable. But of course, the longer this lasts, the higher the cost will be.
Yeah, we can also mention, the conflict between Algeria and Morocco and the close border. I think that if we can have a big market between Morocco and Algeria, it would help. But from my perspective, I don't see any progress this year. Hopefully, maybe in the coming years. Naku, do you want to add something on the geopolitical side?
Thanks, Benoit. I think Mikhail has covered them quite comprehensively. The only point I would also add is, while there's a lot of focus on Suez Canal transports, there's also investment into the Suez Canal zone that is being deterred by the attacks. So, there are Chinese manufacturers who were looking to invest in production facilities around the zone for export to Europe, and now they're reconsidering those decisions. And it's still very early stages, but the longer the situation goes on, the more you see those kinds of FDI flows maybe reconsidering. And that will again impact Egypt because it's, at this critical time of attracting FX into the economy, of diversifying the ownership structure, it's really relying on investment into the Suez Canal zone, into green hydrogen, green ammonia, etc. But all those potential sources of investment are now on pause as they see the situation develop.
Yes, absolutely. And regarding the investment sectors, you mentioned, renewable energy, because we see that North Africa countries are increasingly focusing on diversifying their economies beyond, oil and gas. What sector do you believe present promising opportunities for investors in North Africa? You mentioned renewable energy. I know that there's a lot of countries in North Africa, including in Morocco, that there's a lot of, investment in renewable energy. The objective of Morocco, I know, is that 50% of their energy comes from their own renewable energy. How do you see, the different sectors in the coming months?
Thanks, Benoit. I think there are probably about 3 or 4 broad sectoral themes driving interest in the region. So there is the energy transition, so looking at gas flows from the Mediterranean, but also renewable energy and the capacity to export in some form, or develop related commodities like green hydrogen, green ammonia. Then there is the hype or maybe real promise around nearshoring or friendshoring. So, after COVID and after US-China rivalry, many countries are now looking at where to put their China +1 strategy and have alternative supply chain sources. So North Africa, given its proximity to Europe, is a natural base for that. So that is another source, and Morocco has been the most successful, I would say, amongst North African countries in building a manufacturing hub as a supplier to European markets. So that's another theme that's driving it. And then probably the third sectorial theme would be around the domestic economy, and in particular, the demographic potential, because at the end of the day, these are still young and growing markets, and even with the macroeconomic stress that they are currently going through, there's still need for all the things people need, ranging from packaging to fast-moving consumer goods to real estate, etc. And perhaps the investment into those areas might come more from GCC sources than, say, Europe. But I think those are the 3 sectoral drivers that we see right now.
Yes, absolutely. We're now running out of time, but I'd like to ask you a last question. We discuss and we appreciate that there's, some challenges for the North African countries. And Michael, do you have a specific example in mind of economic resilience in the region? And what kind of lessons we can be drawn from this example to overcome, those challenges? Because, there's some quite huge challenges related to political stability and long-term economic sustainability.
Yes, I think Morocco certainly stands out as an example of resiliency in the face of multiple shocks in recent years. If you think about the pandemic or the global economic headwinds of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the more frequent episodes of drought that we've discussed, and of course last year's earthquake, Morocco has been able to absorb those blows to a large extent. I think what has been key to supporting that resilience is, I think, ultimately solid institutions and policy effectiveness. Morocco has a track record of maintaining not just fiscal discipline and price stability, but also implementing challenging reforms. So whether you think of subsidy reform, the expansion of the social safety net, the implementation of parametric pension reform, just to name a few. And the shocks that Morocco has gone through have, in a way, intensified the resolve of the government to strengthen the progress in these, but also in other areas. So reforming the SOE sector, the state-owned enterprise sector, improving education as well, which is key to addressing some of the key structural constraints to growth. I think also important is really the commitment in terms of having a long-term growth strategy to improve the economic resilience to climate change, and then to expand as well the share of renewable energy sources in electricity production. And I think in a way that's been supported by a favorable security and political stability track record, but I would say there's a bit of a positive feedback loop between the two. So that resiliency helps in turn to support the political stability. But as well in Egypt, I think as well, we've seen an ability to undertake what are quite difficult structural reforms under the anchor provided by programs with the IMF. I think the fact that Egypt has been able to implement a structural shift to primary fiscal surpluses, for instance, so the surplus before the interest payments are taken into account. I was also able to undertake energy subsidy reform. So, overall, I think this is something we very much take into account in our assessment. The strength of institutions, the quality of policymaking, I think are important, particularly during periods of stress.
Thank you, Michael. Naku, anything to add?
Actually, no, I would just be repeating what Mikael said. Morocco is clearly the a bright spot because of its track record of policy effectiveness, and delivery of the diversification strategy. So I will leave it at that because Mikael covered it very well.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So I think it is now time to take the question from the
Sure.
audience. One first question, and of course, Miguel or Naku, you jump in. What are the current economic ties between North Africa and the Sub-Saharan Africa, and how they can be strengthened? So it is a question. I don't know if Miguel or Naku, you want either one of you. The
I can take a
relationship
stab
between
at
North
it. Yeah.
Africa.
North Africa and Sub-Saharan. I think so far, in objective terms, Morocco again has been the most prominent, particularly with its financial institutions expanding into other Francophone West African countries. Egypt is, prior to the recent shocks, was trying to extend its range of exports to other African countries, but I think that focus might be waning because it's very much focused on domestic issues right now. So, but other than that, generally, inter-African or inter-North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa ties are still evolving.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think historically Europe has been a dominant partner for many of those countries, partly going back to historical ties, partly given geography. But I think Morocco has been able to make a bit more of an expansion into Africa, essentially positioning itself as a bit of a hub between the two continents. The banking sector of Morocco in particular has expanded quite significantly in West Africa. Now that's brought, I think, challenges in terms of additional asset risk, perhaps a slightly different operating environment, but it's also brought a lot of opportunities.
Thank you. Obviously, Morocco, as a south-to-south political, driven by the government of Morocco, because we do not want to be so dependent from European countries now. So another question: is the region taking advantage of its natural resources and making green growth an urgent priority? I think we mentioned some key issues regarding the renewable energy. But do you have something to add on this question? Naku or Michael, it's up to you.
I think climatic issues are definitely a priority. Well, for Egypt is existential because they face extreme water stress and salination of their water sources at the mouth of the Nile, and their entire agricultural value chain is at risk of reduced water supply and also higher salt levels coming through. So from that perspective, there's a lot of concern in the region. Where there is an explicit green growth strategy, I would say it's maybe around renewables and increasingly around things like export of natural gas or green hydrogen and ammonia to Europe from the region.
Yes, thank you, Naku. Maybe last question regarding the political side. How significant is North Africa in shaping regional stability and security between Europe and Africa? I don't know if Miguel, you want to take this one, or Naku, you have some clues.
I'll let Mikkel start and then I'll add some comments. Yeah.
It's a challenging question. It reminds me of my Sciences Po days to some extent. I think obviously the region has a huge role to play in terms of both acting as a liaison between Europe and the continent as a whole. And I think the geopolitical, geostrategic implications are, if anything, certainly coming to the forefront of the last few years, whether that be the migration angle, which has always been, I guess, a focus, but also the geopolitical risks that we are seeing at the moment. I think there's a imperative from, I think, all the parties and countries involved to see stability across the region, to see strong economic growth and providing employment opportunities for the young people of the North African economies. But obviously, as well, I think just from an economic perspective, the investment opportunities will continue to be there, as we see in the automobile sector and the linkages between the Moroccan automobile industry and European players. And as I mentioned in my remark on Morocco, there'll continue to be opportunities between North Africa and the rest of the continent as well, coming up in specific sectors.
Thank you, Mikkel.
Yeah. Thank you, Mikkel. I would also add maybe the audience member who asked this was thinking of the range of geopolitical issues that are affecting the region. So if you start from Egypt, and its exposure to Middle Eastern conflicts, moving into the collapse of Libya, looking at the rise in instability in the Sahel, that is also impinging on, the southern parts of Algeria, Morocco, and how particularly Algeria and Morocco, who are relatively stable compared to the other three right now, and Egypt as well, are trying to prevent spillovers of this increased conflict, chaos, these increased voids of lawlessness in the Sahel from spilling over into their own countries. And then, of course, as Mikkel mentioned, for Europe, looking down to the region, it's more about controlling the flow of migrants. So in that sense, North Africa has become quite pivotal for a lot of concerns that are right now still regional, but could become more serious global issues, but definitely for their own local safety, there is a strong interest in controlling things like the instability in the Sahel, the metamorphosis of Islamic groups, Tuaregs seeking self-determination, seeking to form a state, how that fits in with, the spillover of conflict from Libya and the explosion in terms of arms, illicit trade and activity there. So there's definitely a situation that the world should probably pay more attention to, but right now the world isn't. And it is mainly the governments of Egypt, Algeria, Morocco who are paying attention to these issues because it impacts them in the first instance. And then you have the added layer for Egypt of Middle East conflict also spilling onto its eastern border. So it's a time of elevated geopolitical concerns for the region.
Thank you, Naku. And I think we're going to finish our very important discussion on this topic. Thank you both for participating to this webinar. It was a very insightful discussion. And Chantal, I hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benoit. I think you will all agree that this panel was constructive, a great insight into a mixed, albeit positive, outlook. We talked about the dependence on the credibility of governments, but we also talked about the resilience of North Africa. So thank you very much for this fantastic moderating, Benoit. And I also thank you, Naku and Mikkel, for your thought-provoking views that we can now go and digest in our planning for North Africa for the rest of the year. A quick reminder that a recording of this webcast will be available to share with your colleagues and other interested parties who may find it helpful. So please join us again on Monday when we are going to look at Invest Africa's outlook for East Africa. So that brings our Invest Africa outlook for North Africa 2024 to a close. Thank you very much for participating, and goodbye until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.